Now, the new landscape is very interactive. There's a lot of thought about how can we actually accelerate and build on interactions across the councils. I think it's firstly worth noting 25% of all MRC's funding is done in partnership with one or other organisation, funding organisation, whether it's charities, research councils or internationally. And really this is just going to accelerate that approach. The other sort of really good news is that this launch of UKRI comes at a time when more money is being put into the system. And if you hadn't appreciated, over the next 4 years, the money that's being put in as a result of the National Productivity Investment Fund, which has a component of R&D, which is about 4.7 of that 7 billion, that is essentially an uplift of nearly 30% on the UK R&D budget over 4 years. So there's various schemes that you're aware of. I'll touch on those as we go forward. MRC continually wants to ensure that we understand what the community is thinking. This is part of that process. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of other things MRC does to ensure it connects to the community. We do have a scheme now which is very successful. Other funders are looking at it in terms of observers onto our boards and panels. So we would typically allow people holding early career MRC grants to come in and sit through an afternoon of our board meetings such that they can see how the peer review process works, understand the dynamic. And I would say by and large, everyone is really pleasantly surprised by the objectivity and effort put into the peer review process. And of course, those people then become ambassadors to some extent for the approach that's being used. We obviously have our network magazine, we have regular consultations, and as I'll come on to, we are doing a strategy refresh and we have been talking quite widely with the community. Science contacts, we have had a fair amount of flux in staff over the last 2 years, but we have approximately 43 program managers. We're recruiting right now, so the numbers ebb and flow a little bit, but their responsibilities are on the web, and please do feel that you should contact the program managers if you're thinking of applying to MRC. Surprises me how few people actually do that, because quite often, unless it fits absolutely square on a scheme or a board area, it's worth having a discussion to see if it's what's the most appropriate route to apply to MRC. The current MRC strategic approach, this is published in terms of Research Changes Lives, and I won't go through the list of the topic areas here, but you'll recognise the priority challenges are the big ticket items in terms of public health burden, societal need, and also new and novel therapeutics, so the advanced therapies, for example. But Discovery for Medicine is increasingly looking at systems and building up from reductionist approaches, and we are particularly keen to sort of promote mechanism to population and back. That is, how do you link cell and molecular pathways type work to actually the insights that population level science through cohorts and increasingly big data can provide, and then how can that help provide new questions that more basic science can address. And then transforming health research and innovation on the far right. I think data science and computation, we all understand that probably the landscape of how we do science over the next 10 years will shift significantly from wet to dry. And there's a need to skill up and put in infrastructure around data science and computation, and that's a big focus of our activity. Stratified medicine, we are now sort of pushing forward on that under the precision medicine moniker. Stratified medicine to some extent is the better name for what we're doing, but nevertheless precision medicine is the term that's recognised internationally and through industry partners. So you will now see us using precision medicine more generally than stratified. That's just a snapshot of our funding portfolio. It doesn't change dramatically year on year. If I walk round the clock from 12 o'clock, through the green is the researcher-led response mode 3 and 5 year grants typically. That's 31% of our portfolio. This is spend on an annual basis, okay, and represents about £700 million of spend per annum. Directed or managed funding in yellow is where we have calls for proposals with a specific target. It's still researcher-led, but they are to some extent targeted at certain areas, and that would include some of our translational funding, for example. Facilities and platforms, obviously biobanks, data repositories, other facilities would be in there. And then in terms of our units and institutes, collectively that's about 38% of our portfolio, and that's where we're directly investing, as you know, into 5-year strategic investments in the university system. All of our units are now embedded in the university, apart from the Harwell site, and all of our institutes are operating in the university context, the only exception being LMB in Cambridge, which is still wholly owned by MRC. The new institutes we've set up, UK Dementia Research Institute and Health Data Research UK, are not yet showing on this. This is spend for 17-18, and they're only just getting going. And then at the very top, about 10% of our portfolio is on training. Again, very quickly, this sort of bar chart shows the type of funding if you categorize it according to the kind of UK CRC criteria, which all of the UK funders use in the life science area, from discovery science through to translation and applied on the right-hand side. That's a 5-year average. The translation side, I mean, MRC is quite often accused of being obsessed with translation to the detriment of discovery science. We actively talk about translation. It's been a very important topic to get across to government and to the public about the value and use of science, and obviously in attracting industry. But the reality is our translation and applied portfolio has been reasonably consistent over the last 5 years. Where we have had shift, if you went into the last 2 or 3 years, is a slight move towards that middle blue area, which is to some extent etiological research, away from absolutely blue skies research in the brown and grey. But nevertheless, blue skies research is nearly 30% of our portfolio, and nearly 70% of our portfolio is discovery science. The bar below just shows the amalgamated public sector and research charity spend. This chart shows response rates, award rates by research board across our portfolios. And these figures are averaged over 3 years. There is some lumpiness, and as you will look down the vertical from our 4 boards, IIB, MCMB, NMHB and PSMB, again, there are some variations of different elements of that portfolio, especially where the numbers of awards are low in programs, partnerships and centres, for example. But you can see the typical researcher-led response mode grants are in the region of 15-17% award rate, which is obviously lower than we would like it to be. But the demand is what it is, and the budget we've got available is what it is. So the boards have a challenging decision in terms of determining which of the grants that come into us get funded. Of course, it's done on quality. There's a transparent sort of evaluation system on our website about how that's done. But nevertheless, choices have to be made sometimes about grants that score very equivalently. And what the boards have recently done is published something which we call funding opportunities, and they're listed there under each board. And these are areas where the boards are wanting to see more applications and wanting to invest in high quality science in these particular areas. And how that manifests itself at the decision point is if you were to apply to the boards and fit any of those areas, the boards would effectively prioritise that type of grant over another grant, assuming the quality level was equivalent. So if things score the same and they're in an opportunity area, they will get a priority for funding. That doesn't really affect particularly many grants right now, but it is worth reading about those board opportunities and considering whether your type of applications can fit there. I think most of them are pretty self-explanatory by title. I'm going to come on to multimorbidities and sort of data integration and systems a bit later. Just going back to the table, the caveat in terms of the percentages of programme grants and centres and partnerships, these are managed grants, so to some extent there's a lot of dialogue with applicants before the final bids come in, so you would anticipate award rates for those would be somewhat higher. MRC and career training, this is a kind of infogram of the numbers of different types of training and career development posts through the life course, going from left to right. You can see at any one time MRC supports 1,600 studentships, for example. The majority of those are in doctoral training partnerships, but many are within our centres, units and institutes. And then as you go through, we've got the postdoctoral cadre, largely on research grants in green. And then the transition to independence is the last circle. And you can see, if you go to the extreme right, the current numbers of people who are either senior fellows, program leaders in our units or institutes, or PIs on grants is that number. So it's quite a steep pyramid in terms of transition across careers. The two areas I'll come to on the next slide, but just point them out now. We are looking at, which one the pointer works actually, sorry. Underneath the postdoctoral ring in the centre, we are shortly to launch a scheme called Clinical Academic Research Partnership, which is to encourage clinicians who have done some research training but are no longer research active to hook back into the system and connect with research labs. And under the transition to independence stage, we have the UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellowships, which I think you will all know about, but essentially this is nearly 900 million that has been put into the system through UK Research and Innovation to support fellowships that are a 7-year period, 4 of which is fully supported by UKRI, 3 of which on renewal would require more institutional support. And this will bring in across the science domain around 200 fellows per annum. And in terms of MRC's portfolio slice, we would expect that about 20-25% of those will land in our sort of domain of interest. So that's an early impact of UKRI. Very briefly, where we have thought about the training and career pipeline, we have particularly been thinking around flexibility, especially to encourage women in science, family-friendly sort of training and so on. So time-bound criteria were relaxed by MRC a couple of years ago. Other funders have now followed that, and that's proved very successful. We want to recognise research staff who contribute to grants in a junior position as giving them researcher co-investigator status, which should also help promote careers. And as I say, clinical research careers, we're concerned about the lack of or the failing pipeline of clinical scientists, and we'll be shortly promoting a new clinical academic research program, CARP being the acronym. Important to get the letters the right way around. And that will be short sort of scale funding to prime people to come back into the research system where we have PhD qualified research sort of competent consultants who maybe have given up for various reasons. And the other issue is that we are really trying to enhance skills around bioinformatics, data science, and so on. And there's a lot of activity in that area that I'm sure you're aware of. Global health remains a key priority. As you will be aware, this was boosted a couple of years, 3 years ago now, by a large investment into the Global Challenges Research Fund, with nearly 1.5 billion being put in by UK government to this area to promote research in low and middle income countries. It wasn't clear at that time whether that was going to be a sustained investment in the long term, but all the signs from government and indeed all of the political parties are that this funding stream will be maintained, and there is a lot of consideration of how we do research to benefit low and middle income countries. So some of the global health agenda has been an acceleration of MRC's existing work, because we do a lot of work in Africa, for example, where we have 2 units, and around communicable diseases and so on. But there have been these new interdisciplinary awards, as you know, through originally Research Council UK, now picked up by UKRI. The key thing for us is to, in this growth, see a bigger shift into non-communicable disease areas, and particularly mental health, cancer and maternal health being areas that we're really trying to actively promote at this time. This is a snapshot of our translational funding schemes. I think that there's nothing particularly new in the schemes that are up there, but that's trying to put the various pots into one line for you so that you can see where they sit. I suppose the 2 newest things there are in purple, the therapeutic target validation near the bottom of that screen, where again we are targeting in 2 particular areas where industry is not readily investing at the moment because of the lack of new targets, antimicrobial resistance and mental health. And this is really seen as a pinch point in terms of therapeutic development at the moment, moving from putative targets to validated targets where companies would actually develop lead compounds towards. The award rates, it's worth just pointing out that overall the award rates are pretty consistent with MRC's current award rates, but where applications come to us with an industry link, the award rates are higher. That isn't because we're prioritising awards with industry links. So MICA means the MRC Industrial Collaboration Awards, which is a standardised contract. But what it does reflect, of course, is that the fact that the project is at a likely point of maturity, where commercial interest is giving it some degree of credibility, and so you can put all that together, you can see why they would look more attractive for funding. Very briefly, we continue to want to promote industry partnerships. We are thinking in a couple of areas beyond the traditional biopharma and diagnostics areas. So in our nutrition research scheme at the moment, we're trying to find ways of partnering with the food industry for in a productive sense to actually move the nutrition research agenda forward in a positive way. And we're obviously looking hard at how we partner some of the digital industries who wouldn't necessarily have had a background in R&D. In all of this, we have to, of course, respect the fact that we're using public money. We have to obey state aid rules, and all of our partnerships are based on open innovation and pre-competitive collaboration, and we have an absolute requirement that data is released and IP is made available through the university partners and so on. We have a number of activities and continue to wish to encourage applications that might be using the AstraZeneca disease assay platform in Cambridge, the UCB antibody platform, and also the compounds that have proved to be clinically passed but stalled on pharmaceutical companies' shelves. So we've got a sort of asset scheme that can be accessed as well. So all of these schemes are open in response mode. They're all accessible to all parts of the UK community, and again, if you haven't looked at those, I encourage you to do so. So we are currently pushing on to a strategy refresh, and we have been consulting around this. So just got a few slides to give you sight of where we're going. UKRI published its own strategic prospectus at its launch, and that's represented in the boxes below in terms of the global headlines of what UKRI wished to do. And now the research councils and Innovate UK and Research England are all going to publish a strategic plan next year around April time, which will align with that but indicate what the individual councils are doing. And this will inform a spending review. We don't precisely know where the spending review will be. There are obviously quite a lot of political churn at the moment, which will influence the precise timing. But we're again expecting this probably in March, April next year. So there's a lot of thinking at the moment about how do we position our ambition and align that with the funding partners within UKRI. It's worth mentioning at the moment, just to bring it all into one place, that we are dealing with a lot of new funding coming into UKRI at the moment, and some of these calls are influencing our strategic thinking. So if I just walk around the boxes that are left there, I'm sure some of you will have come across one or two of these, perhaps in terms of interest of developing bids. But again, these boxes represent the bulk of where this large investment of nearly 2 billion of research over 4 years is being placed. The majority in the industry strategy challenge funds, in fact that is 2 billion, there's more in the other boxes. And that is research that is primed to promote industry engagement in the UK and inward investment. So to some extent, very much focused on what will build new business, bring employment and so on. So very applied short-term objectives. The Strategic Priorities Fund, if again going clockwise, is the scheme that to some extent represents Paul Nurse's original sort of manifesto about why we should create UKRI, and that was to have a fund that would allow novel interdisciplinary discovery science at a scale that individual parties couldn't undertake. And the Strategic Priorities Fund at this point in time has a budget of nearly 550 million. Talent and skills, I've already mentioned the Future Leader Fellowships. There's also been a lot of PhDs put into artificial intelligence and informatics as well. The Fund for International Collaboration is to partner advanced scientific nations, so it's at the other end of the spectrum to GCRF, which was about lower middle income countries. And that's a fairly modest in these terms scheme of 100 million or so, but to fund partnerships really in the non-EU partners at this point in time. Japan, Korea, for example, we're already developing links through this scheme with. And Strengths in Places is to represent regionality. So collectively, those areas of investment are creating this churn of funding calls at the moment. Most of these are being launched as they call them waves rather than specific calls. So ISCF is on wave 3, SPF has just gone through wave 1 and so on, and I'll just mention our particular interest on those in a second. It's worth just saying that I think the community finds the speed of this a little bit sort of difficult to deal with, so do we as funders, but it is a consequence of the fact that an argument was made to government to give R&D a boost in this country. The Treasury expects that money to be spent. The timelines are very ambitious given the scale of funding, and we're all working collectively to ensure that in putting this money into the system, quality standards and strategic opportunity are aligned as best we can. So MRC's initial thinking, developed in consultation with our boards, panels, some surveys with early career researchers and so on and so forth, has ended up with these particular strands of activity which will represent the foci of our strategy refresh going forward. So very briefly, along the top, Prevention, we very much want to continue the sort of work that we've pushed out under the UK Prevention Research Partnership of thinking how we can work at the population level, but also target preventive strategies into basically populations at risk, such that they don't actually manifest in terms of diseases and problems that we have to treat expensively down the line. Part of that, of course, also requires early detection, and we and others are very interested in thinking about new detector technologies, new ways of finding populations that we can monitor prospectively, such that we can understand the early signals that might indicate disease progression and enable early intervention. Precision medicine, we've been active in the Stratified Medicine Consortia. King's is involved in some of those, and again we feel that's been a very successful scheme which we will proceed with, and global health I've already mentioned. On the bottom, quantitative and computational, as I say, we need to skill up the UK ecosystem in terms of computational capability and also quantitative skills that would allow us to analyse complex data sets and really sort of bring measurement and quantification into the biological science area. Multidimensional cell biology, again, really means how do we actually scale out from interactions that might be at the epigenetic level through the pathways within the cell to cell interactions to the tissues and so on. And again, a lot of investment probably around new microscopy technologies and so on. Mental health I'll come back to. I know it's an interest for King's College in particular. Big push there to basically build a sort of platform base for significant investment in mental health. And again, antimicrobial resistance, we want to scale up from where we are. In terms of supporting and facilitating science, I think it's worth stressing that MRC is very active in wanting to promote open science, and we are signed up to the principles of the Open Research Data Concordat. As you know, funding applications we require now to have data management plans in place, appropriately funded, such that data can be discoverable and accessed, collected and managed and so on. All of our trials and public health interventions have to be registered, and we are promoting better access to clinical trial data, as said there. We have a regulatory support centre, which I hope you're aware of. There's a lot of resource there that you can access to guide your way through. And again, in terms of cohorts and thinking for the future, we are increasingly seeking to ensure that any renewal of our population studies comes hand in hand with an agenda which is to facilitate discoverability and access of the data on cohorts. It's public sector funding. We of course respect some periods of exclusivity in a limited sense for people who are generating the data, but all of this data has to be put into the public domain, and of course Wellcome are aligned with that, as are other parts of the UK ecosystem. So it's just worth bearing that in mind, and certainly at boards and panels, if there are issues around data or tools or reagents, whatever it might be, being made accessible, then the boards will query that at review point. Now I'll pause there and just take some questions, and then what I was asked to do was, we've got a list of topics of which there is a single slide on each of these to follow, but these slides will be left with you. But I was going to talk briefly through the top 6 of those which had a particular interest for King's, but I thought I could just pause there and take some questions on any of those aspects that I've discussed.
Perhaps I could kick off and just go back to the car concept, something that we evidently would be interested in the context of our academic health science centre and the abundance of clinically active individuals who've had a research training. Do you want to just try and give us a sense of how that might operate, the provision of an amount of research time for those folk is interesting, but comes with a massive challenge around the backfill of the current clinical activity that they are committed to. And I wonder whether you and others have had a chance to really think how that would play out in reality.
Well,
particularly over a short period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I can say at this stage is we haven't finalised how this will operate. We've identified the money that we want to put into the system. We are talking to various players to make sure that this can bed in effectively. But as you say, we need an understanding, exactly as you say, to ensure that there are no sort of perverse incentives around this. So it's easy to say that we will provide some funding for people to link up to labs, but we need a clear understanding of how that will operate. And if we need to put money in at that level to help buy out time, then we have to think about that too.
Would the folks mind introducing themselves as if you can ask a question?
Stefan Menzel, I'm a geneticist working in hematology. I have a question regarding data sharing. And what kind of guidance is there available for genetic data sharing? We're always a little bit reluctant of sharing individual genotypes for people because you start with one genotype and there's this sliding scale until it becomes an identifiable data set. So what is the MRC policy on that?
Yeah, I mean, as you identify, there's been a lot of work being considered around pseudo-anonymization and protection of identities and so on. Essentially, MRC's policies are really manifest through things like UK Biobank, GEL, and some of the other case control studies we've done. The Regulatory Support Centre has some guidance, generic guidance, but we can signpost you to various, if you contact through that, various expertise that have dealt with this. So, I mean, UK Biobank, as you can imagine, are now doing whole genome sequencing. They've also already released a lot of their genetic data. So they have been through this incredibly detailed through their Access Committee and Ethics and Governance Committee. And there are guidelines available through the UK Biobank as well.
Stunned silence, the wealth of new opportunities. That's
Shall I just?
why you want someone to.
Yeah, just so again, these are quite sort of top level snapshots of some areas that we are particularly pushing forward. Population health sciences, I think we fully recognise that the UK is incredibly well positioned globally in terms of population health resources. There's a rich history of cohort studies. We obviously have the NHS, which we're not sort of fully able to exploit at this point in time, but there's a lot of work going on there to make sure that we can use the NHS productively in research. And this has made the UK very attractive to the industry sector globally. And we've already seen this in dementia research, for example. So there is active consideration of the sorts of new cohorts that we might need to develop, and perhaps new ways of recruiting to new cohorts, which I think to some extent, we're in a different domain now, and we need to think about perhaps more sort of active social media type recruitment processes and so on. There may be cases for creating entirely new cohorts, but most of the effort and most of the advice we've gleaned to date is to actually enhance existing cohorts or create linkages across cohorts in the lifespan. But we are working with Wellcome, with the Economic and Social Research Council in particular, around thinking about how this is going to be developed. We obviously need the platforms and the standard operating procedures to do omics sort of analyses at scale. We need to think about investing in innovative technologies and diagnostics, as I say, coming back to the early detection agenda. And again, there are a lot of SMEs out there that could be active in this space that we want to incorporate. And we are thinking quite hard about centralised resources, what sort of support for data access, as you said, anonymisation in various levels and so on, and secure data. And again, that's part of Health Data Research UK's agenda, to help think about data, secure data management and so on. So in terms of some of the support for this, I mean, we've already been able, through the Industry Strategy Challenge Funds, to realise some funding for UK Biobank whole genome sequencing. There is another programme in there which is trying to think about diagnostics and the use of artificial intelligence to scale data sets and so on. So this is going to be a very rich theme of how we move forward. Protocols for informatics and data linkage obviously need to be thought about, and again, Health Data Research UK is not the answer to everything in this field, but we are expecting it to provide a guiding light and some coalescence of expertise in this area. And there's a lot of interest from other parts of government. Actually, UKRI, to some extent, the creation of that has shone a spotlight, such as the Department of Education, the use of administrative data sets, better synergies between how ESRC sort of conceptualise data and the way MRC does, and so on. So I think Arts and Humanities Research Council, for example, interested in this space as well. And of course, in terms of the data management and IT infrastructure, whether we're looking at meteorological science, economic research, and so on, some of the ways we manage data sets and think about secure cloud computing type approaches, which will underpin all of this. We are now increasingly talking to these other domains of interest. So, tackling antimicrobial resistance, I mean, collectively over the last 5 years, MRC and other parties in a coordinated way have invested nearly 80 million into this space. And it's very much about the One Health agenda, so recognising that it's not just about hospitals and new antibiotics. There's an issue about population level behaviour, there's an issue about veterinary science and the food chain, and there's an issue about international sort of connectivity. So, for example, many of the problems that we may face in this area are probably going to emerge from other parts of the globe before they hit the UK. So we are working up various bids at the moment, and a big preparation under the Comprehensive Spending Review to boost our work in antimicrobial resistance. And one element of that we are actively thinking about is formalising a research platform to support this in terms of a hub and spokes type approach. I mean, there's not much I can say on that because it will be dependent on the scale of funding we get from government under the next CSR. But it's just to say, whatever happens, we will continue to push forward and grow this area. And I think, as you know, Sally Davis mentions this every time she possibly can. But it is globally recognised as a massive problem we need to address. Interface with physical sciences, there's been quite a lot of interest over the last few years in developing a better connection between life science and physical science at the discovery end. We've had a long-term relationship with EPSRC, for example, around imaging technologies and informatics and so on. And we have, through our institutes at LMB, the Francis Crick Institute, and at the level of RegenMed, UK Regenerative Medicine Platform, for example, found various ways of promoting quite sort of basic interdisciplinary science agendas. Nevertheless, if we want to think about disruptive technologies, if we want to think about promoting new industries in the UK, it's a space we really have to be active with. MRC's certainly thinking about this, EPSRC is thinking about this very strongly, so are Wellcome and so on. Now, in terms of the next 12 months, we already have a modestly funded technology touching life network, which we're seeking to develop. EPSRC has a physics of life network, and there has been new funding realised which will sort of come into the system over the next 6 to 12 months to boost the physics of life activity. And this is really trying to connect fundamental physics to biology. And we will seek with BBSRC as a partner to make sure we can use this to develop new technology approaches. The Rosalind Franklin Institute has been set up on the Harwell site, and that is being sort of filled in terms of scientific direction at the moment, but it's got a very life science heavy direction of travel. And we certainly think that novel bioimaging, novel chemical biology interfaces, and so on will be emerging from there. And the Rosalind Franklin Institute is supposed to connect nationally, of course. We will be investing heavily, again, money spending review dependent on new bioimaging capability, and making sure that we can image at the sub-cryo-EM level right through to body level imaging. And of course, all of this now requires, I think, the involvement of artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms of the way we handle approaches in this space. So I think, again, over the next 12 to 24 months, there will be a lot of activity in this area to look out for. Mental health. We refreshed our strategy in 2017, and I won't rehearse what was said there. The key bullets about what we're trying to do in terms of mental health are up there. We've also got a developing agenda about mind and sort of mental health relationships. So there's also the concept which interests, for example, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Economic and Social Research Council, and so on, around how we conceptualize culture and mind and so on. So a lot of developing thinking there. But turning back to the mental health agenda that MRC wants to push forward, again, modelling on what we've done in the dementia space, we think there is a lot of activity, and King's involvement in this is fully recognised, where there is significant expertise in certain parts of the UK landscape, and what we're seeking to do is create a platform that binds this together in a productive way. We've already put some awards out in terms of Pathfinder activities to create a little bit of momentum in this space, and again are anticipating spending review money coming to us to push forwards in a far more ambitious way in this area. And again, how we can use our cohorts, how we can use the sort of life course data that we have assembled in various ways and connect that up, and think about aligning that to some of the data informatics opportunities will be very, very central to how we take this forward. Multimorbidity, you may be aware that the Academy of Medical Sciences held a workshop, published a report on multimorbidity. MRC, again, when we sort of set up the dementia approach, we were very keen to pursue a multimorbidity agenda around the development of dementia. And we're now trying to sort of push this out more proactively into the community, the concept that clearly a number of disease modalities cluster. They could be purely for the fact that some diseases are common and they're bound to be coincidentally recognised in people as they age. But it's also increasingly emerging that there are likely to be common mechanistic determinants that manifest themselves in different disorders at different times. So at the moment we've got a fairly modest call out, partnered with NIHR, who are again very interested in developing this area strategically. And the definitions of what multimorbidity are, of course, you can argue that till the cows come home, but the reality is that we need to make sure that we don't consider disease progression in isolation away from what else is going on in the body. And this agenda will play into a lot more industry interest in terms of sort of multi-therapeutic combinatorial approaches in the future. So again, I think this will be a theme that will emerge more and more strongly over the next decade. And I mean, I'd already talked about the Industry Strategy Challenge Fund a little bit. As I said, this money is being sort of flushed into the system through various waves of activity. Wave 1 was to some extent a quick start that was launched on the basis of obvious and critical things that had already been thought about that could be got underway. So in the life science area, for example, there was a big investment in manufacturing capability for therapeutics under Wave 1. Wave 2 has just concluded, and we have specific interests in healthy aging agenda. A lot of that is about supportive technologies, but also data to early diagnosis and precision medicine, and it's within that stream, which is approximately 200 million. That's the scale of these investments. That has covered 3 main components, one of which is whole genome sequencing on UK Biobank, which of course will be information that will be made available to all, and that will support whole genome sequencing. I think it's for about 30,000 at the moment, moving up to 50,000 participants. But industry clustering is likely to mean all 500,000 of UK Biobank will be whole genome sequenced within the next 5 years, I would think. Artificial intelligence for pathology is another stream, and the third one is the digital information hubs, which HDR UK is currently rolling out to try and create an enabling resource in terms of NHS data being usable and other data for the research community. And that itself is about 40 million that's gone to HDR UK to deliver. And Wave 3 is ongoing, and we will see what will emerge. But as said there, we're leading on artificial intelligence for drug discovery and early detection, novel diagnostics approach for disease. We remain to be seen what happens. Now, all of these activities, large lumps of funding, the mechanism is then to recruit a challenge director, quite often someone with an industry background, to lead the program and assemble a team to have quite a managed program of investment. Because critical for this particular type of scheme, which is not normal way of funding academic science, is to really be able to report to Treasury that it's made a difference in terms of the economy and jobs and inward investment. And if we fail on that, then the rest of the agenda starts to unravel somewhat. So that's why there's a real push in sort of this sort of managed program of funding. New funding does allow us to be ambitious, and we've collectively got to make sure it works. So there is a list of other things, but I thought I probably saturated you in terms of interest at this point in time.
Thank you again. Perhaps remain a few minutes. Huge amount going on, huge number of opportunities. Any other specific questions or points people wanted to raise or perhaps seek clarification?
Or any concerns as it strikes you as at the coalface of research in terms of this sort of wash of initiatives and strategic funding. As I say, it's our intention to keep the lifeblood of researcher-led bottom-up applications constant. A lot of this we're talking about is new money, but I think our longer-term ambition is to raise the whole baseline of the research councils.
So Rob, maybe I just ask you briefly about industry engagement, which of course is really important in many ways. And in that sense, for example, for many of the AI applications for early detection of disease, of course industry is very engaged in those areas as well, across a broader actually spectrum of industry than the usual players too. But part of that sort of, if you like, thinking laterally requires probably a three-way conversation between the university, actually maybe four-way even, NHS partners, industry and the funders, and being more agile in doing things, because the timelines that these bids are coming in from, if you like, it's really hard. Industry timelines are much longer in terms of investment. You know, they plan already, know what they're going to be investing 2-3 years ahead. So for them to be able to respond quickly is a challenge. So really, I suppose it's more a comment really, early engagement before the call is out and there's 6 weeks to respond
Sure.
is going to be key to make that money really a successful spend.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's fully recognised. I think certainly in wave 3, the calls were specifically designed on the back of industry consultation. So at least you can argue in that case that the sector has been primed and it's their ideas that are coming forward. It's obviously, I think all of this in terms of the ambitious timelines for spend, it's a problem. You can't look a gift horse. If the sector said, actually, we don't need this money right now, give us a year to sort it through, which might actually sort of help developing these things, as you said, then Treasury, of course, would question, well, what is the demand for R&D spending if you say you can manage right now? So it's a very fine balance. I think we recognise that this is a suboptimal way of doing it and perhaps some opportunities are being missed as a result. What we've got to ensure is that the funding that does go out there hits the obvious sweet spots of investment and creates something that actually is a platform for further activity. I think the big issue we've got is engaging especially the SME sector, where this sort of planning blight and just whether these cycles of investments allow them to engage, I think is very challenging, whereas some of the bigger companies can to some extent buy in on a longer term ambition.
One more.
We have a very close network of collaborators in Africa, Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana. And we can adapt to what the call is, what the priorities are, because we work closely together. Presently, what is the best way to access the GCRF funding through the MRC? I realized already that the program manager for the health, for the population health board is responsible for coordinating GCRF. Would that be the best access point to find out?
Yeah. I mean, MRC to some extent, some of the GCRF money has been sort of provided as an uplift to MRC's standard approaches. So to some extent, if you've got an application that can go into the Infections and Immunity Board perhaps, then there is going to be flexibility to fund that through our normal systems. So as the boards are reviewing applications, if we see something that is lower middle income country relevant, then that can draw down on the funding that's available through the GCRF system. Then, of course, there are the bespoke calls that are still emerging at the moment in terms of the GCRF programme. So what I would suggest is, yeah, if you sort of contact the programme manager, we'll soon be having a new programme manager specifically to look after GCRF activity, actually. But right now, if you either go in through Population Systems Medicine Board or Immunity and Infections Board, one of the programme managers will route you to the right place. And I think be able to give you some insight as to what's just coming down the tracks as well.
So the 15-16% success rate for project grants, there must be, well, there are many very good grants that are not funded in these days. Is there any plan to change that, to improve that critical situation?
You mean in terms of increasing the award rate?
Yeah, I mean there must be quite a bit of grants every round that are not funded.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean it's very.
But funding in other areas is growing, but we see more and more researchers that put out fantastic grants.
Yeah, sure.
It's basically, there's no chance.
I mean, as I said, the growth in the funding right now is predicated on certain deliverables. That was the argument to Treasury in terms of national productivity. Of course, we would like to make the argument that can be delivered through response mode funding. and of course, to some extent, some of this could be. So what we have to accept right now is that firstly we need to, we have maintained the budget that's available on our boards. We have had a dip in funding over the last couple of years. We've squeezed other areas and we've maintained the funding that's available on the boards. So the high level of demand and high quality demand is what it is, and the boards have the budget that they have, and I think that's not going to change until we get a new spending review allocation. We obviously, with a lot of these initiatives we're talking about, these are seen as short-term bursts of activity that should settle down into normal routine business. So as I mentioned just now, the long-term ambition is to try and increase our baseline and give ourselves more flexibility to increase the award rates as they are. But at the moment we are in a very sort of tight squeeze on this. The budget that we've got to commit within MRC is pretty static. And as we know, costs of grants are going up for various reasons right now, in exchange rate mechanism and general costs and so on. So that does create an immediate tension. And I think the universities have probably done pretty much as they can do in terms of helping improve the quality filter of what comes to us. So we do get less applications now than we have done over the last few years. But nevertheless, what we've lost is generally the non-competitive tail, and not
of course there are less applications. I mean, because we are getting the impression it's actually harder to get a project granted than getting, in some cases, an working trust investigator award, which is 5 times bigger. I'm not saying those are easy, but it's just the amount of good science that is not funded by the MRC these days is staggering. And I wonder whether there's a better way to communicate to the Treasury that there is a real value in the long term for the UK economy in maintaining. Because by maintaining, I guess we're talking the budget stays flat, and with inflation it's been eaten since 2008 at a constant rate.
Sure.
So I guess by maintaining the current spending rate in these kind of grants, where we keep decreasing the real budget.
Yeah, yeah. No, I fully recognise the issue. I mean, Fiona Watt has sort of stated her sort of concern in the way you have as well about where we are. And as I say, the effort is to make sure that we can increase what we would see the baseline being able to support core MRC business over the next spending reviews. And the arguments are being corralled. We're not sort of wedded to these big flashy initiatives. Yeah, unfortunately, it's very tough. I mean, obviously, the benefit that we have, which perhaps some other sectors don't have in other research councils, is we do at least have a multitude of other charitable funding opportunities as well.
We've got time just for one last question, if that's okay. Rather than arguably sharing these slides,
Yeah.
folk can distribute more widely, please.
Hi, thank you very much for a very useful talk this morning. I'm sure that you heard the argument that mental health doesn't receive the share of the funding in light of the costs for society. And I think that quite often the Research Council's response is that, well, we don't get enough application on research mental health. So my question is that really true, that you don't get enough or a substantial amount of or number of application focusing on mental health? And second is that, does the MRC have a strategy to kind of recalibrate this funding situation, that there's a general sense that mental health doesn't get enough funding to be able to have a real impact on the economy?
Sure, sure. So firstly, we looked 6-7 years ago when we first reviewed the mental health area in recent times, and again 2 years ago. And the award rate for grants coming in on mental health is equivalent to the general award rate. So it is a question of the volume of applications we receive is not very high. There's no systematic discrimination against mental health grants in the system. That's true of fellowships. Very few applications in terms of fellowships coming to us. Absolutely, we recognise the need to push forward, and as I say, we're sort of creating a strategy to try and develop this. It's multifaceted. I mean, we want to obviously grow the area such that people feel that it is tractable, that they can start a career and expect to get the support. So part of that is opening up resources, data sets, cohorts, and that sort of thing. Another part is connecting up in a more synchronized way capabilities, whether it's genetics, imaging, and so on, that might help in terms of biological insights. And the third point is making sure that we actually communicate the agenda, which could be seen as a gap right now between MRC and Economic and Social Research Council, for example. So I think collectively with that effort, what we would hope to see is the fact that long-term commitment to developing a platform for mental health research will encourage the universities to push forward in their own agendas in this area, because it will be seen as a long-term investment strategy. And also that we attract in people from aligned areas of research that may not immediately think that mental health is the right thing to do. And I think that the approach to some extent has proved to have worked quite well for dementia research, which the same arguments were made 6-7 years ago. Now, I'm not saying we will necessarily hit exactly the same sort of level of success in terms of investment and activity, but I think it's broadly recognised something has to be done about mental health.